In 2004, a psychologist named Gloria Mark had a simple question that nobody had thought to ask before. How long does a person actually stay focused on one screen before their mind drifts somewhere else? She started measuring. Her answer was 2.5 minutes. She kept measuring as the years passed. By 2012, that number had fallen to 75 seconds. Her most recent data, collected between 2016 and 2020 at the University of California, Irvine, puts the average at 47 seconds. And the median, meaning the point at which half of all observations fall below, at just 40 seconds. In less than 2 decades, we lost over 2/3 of our ability to stay focused on a single thing. Not because of disease, not because of aging, because of one molecule, and the people who figured out how to exploit it. Its name is dopamine, and right now, while you're watching this, it is actively running inside your brain, deciding how long you will stay here, deciding whether you will open another tab in the next 30 seconds, deciding why last night you kept scrolling for 40 more minutes even though you genuinely wanted to go to sleep. Most people believe they already understand what dopamine is. The pleasure chemical, the feel-good hormone, the neurotransmitter that fires when something good happens to you. That understanding is wrong. It is one of the most consequential misconceptions in the history of neuroscience. Consequential because the companies that understand the truth have built trillion-dollar industries on the fact that you don't. Dopamine is not about pleasure. Dopamine is about wanting, and the distance between those two words is the distance between a life that you direct and a life that the algorithm directs for you. Today, we're going to examine how dopamine actually works, what it does to the architecture of your brain, how it was turned into an instrument of commercial manipulation, and, most importantly, what the science says you can actually do about it. To understand where we are, we have to go back to 1954, to an experiment that shaped everything neuroscience believed about the brain's reward system for the next 4 decades. James Olds and Peter Milner were neuroscientists at McGill University in Montreal. They were implanting electrodes into rat brains, attempting to map different neural regions, when one electrode was placed in the wrong location. What happened next would redefine how scientists understood the relationship between the brain and pleasure. Every time the rat pressed a lever, that misplaced electrode delivered a small electrical pulse to the region where it had landed. The rat pressed the lever again and again, 700 times per hour. It stopped eating, stopped drinking, ignored everything else in its environment. It kept pressing the lever until it physically collapsed from exhaustion. Olds and Milner concluded that they had located what they called the pleasure center, the region of the brain responsible for generating pure, unmediated happiness. They published their findings. The scientific community accepted the theory. For 40 years, it stood as established fact. They were completely wrong. The correction came from Kent Berridge, a neuroscientist at the University of Michigan, who is now the James Olds Distinguished University Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience, a title that is itself a tribute to the man whose theory he would overturn. Berridge's question was simple. If that brain region produces pleasure, what happens when you eliminate the dopamine system entirely? He removed every dopamine-producing neuron from a group of rats. Nothing remained. The results demolished 4 decades of received wisdom. When his team placed sugar directly on the rats' tongues, the animals responded positively. Their facial expressions, which, as Berridge's research had established, are homologous between rats and humans, showed the same reactions you see in human infants tasting something sweet for the first time. The pleasure response was completely intact, but those same rats would not move toward food, even when food was placed within a foot of them. Even as they were starving to death, they experienced pleasure. What they had lost entirely was the motivation to pursue anything. Berridge's conclusion was revolutionary. Dopamine does not generate the experience of pleasure. Dopamine generates the drive to seek it. He proposed a distinction that has since become foundational in neuroscience, that the brain's reward system is not one thing, but 2 completely separate systems that can operate independently of each other. Completely independently. The first is wanting, the craving, the drive, the hunger that motivates you to move towards something. This is the domain of dopamine, running through the large and robust neural circuits of the mesolimbic system. The second is liking, the actual hedonic experience of pleasure when you arrive at what you were seeking. This is governed governed by an entirely separate system, driven by opioids and endocannabinoids in what Berridge calls hedonic hotspots, small, fragile regions that can function perfectly well in the complete absence of dopamine. The implications of this distinction are profound. You can want something intensely that brings you no pleasure when you get it. You can experience genuine pleasure from something you never wanted to pursue. These systems do not have to align, and in the modern world, that misalignment is precisely where the trouble begins. There is a feeling that most people recognize without knowing what to call it. It is the restless energy that occupies you when you are waiting for a text message response from someone who matters to you, or the low-grade agitation you feel when you keep refreshing your email after submitting something important at work, or the compulsive checking of a delivery app that has told you, minutes ago, that your order will not arrive for another half hour. Nothing has happened yet, nothing has arrived, and yet something is unmistakably happening in your brain. That something is dopamine, not in response to receiving a reward, but in response to the anticipation of one. Robert Sapolsky is a professor of biology and neurology at Stanford University who has spent decades studying one specific question: exactly when does dopamine fire and why? His research with primates demonstrated the answer with particular clarity. He trained monkeys on a simple conditioning task: see a signal, perform a behavior, receive a food reward. In the early stages of training, when the association between signal and reward was still being established, dopamine fired at the moment the food arrived, which is exactly what the pleasure chemical model of dopamine would predict. But once the monkeys had fully learned the pattern, the timing of dopamine release shifted completely. Dopamine stopped firing at the moment of reward. It began firing at the moment the signal appeared, during the window of anticipation, the not yet knowing, the gap between expectation and outcome. When Sapolsky then removed the reward entirely, when the signal appeared but nothing followed, dopamine spiked in anticipation and then crashed below its normal baseline. The animals showed behavioral signs consistent with frustration and anxiety, and their response to that uncomfortable drop below baseline was to try again. This dynamic was later formalized by Wolfram Schultz, a neuroscientist at Cambridge University whose work on reward prediction error earned him a share of the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2017. The core finding is simple. When the brain predicts a reward and doesn't receive it, dopamine drops below baseline, and that drop is aversive enough to immediately drive another attempt. This is the wanting loop, and it is ancient. In the environment in which human neurology evolved, one of scarcity, unpredictable resources, and constant existential uncertainty, a system that kept pushing you to keep searching, even after repeated failure, was not a pathology. It was the reason your ancestors survived when others didn't. In a world of infinite digital content designed by engineers who understand this system better than most neuroscientists, it operates against you around the clock. In November of 2017, Sean Parker, the founding president of Facebook, the man Mark Zuckerberg gave the first serious money to build the company, someone who was present in the room when the foundational decisions about the platform were made, gave an interview to Axios that received less attention than it deserved. He described the thinking behind Facebook's design with unusual candor. The goal, he said, was to consume as much of your time and conscious attention as possible. The mechanism was a social validation feedback loop, and here are his exact words. We need to sort of give you a little dopamine hit every once in a while because someone liked or commented on a photo or a post or whatever. It's a social validation feedback loop, exactly the kind of thing that a hacker like myself would come up with, because you're exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology. He added that the founders understood this consciously and did it anyway. The mechanism Parker described maps precisely onto Sapolsky's research. When you post something and don't know how many people will respond, whether the answer will be 0 or 50 or 500, you have created exactly the conditions that maximize dopamine release. Not the guaranteed reward, but the uncertain one. The dopamine doesn't spike when the likes arrive. It spikes in the gap between posting and not yet knowing. That gap is the fuel, and the platforms are engineered to keep you living in it. The behavioral psychology concept underlying this design is called variable ratio reinforcement, a schedule of reward delivery in which the reward arrives randomly, sometimes after one attempt and sometimes after many, with no predictable pattern. Research on conditioning has consistently found that behaviors maintained on a variable ratio schedule are the most resistant to extinction of any reinforcement pattern, which is why the same mechanic is the structural foundation of slot machine design. You do not win on every pull. You win sometimes unpredictably, and that unpredictability is precisely what makes it so difficult to stop. The vast majority of what what you scroll past. The estimates typically range around 90%, produces no meaningful response in your brain. But occasionally something hits, something genuinely funny, or genuinely outrageous, or genuinely moving. Your brain registers that hit, stores it as evidence that the next scroll might produce another, and the loop continues. Instagram, TikTok, YouTube Shorts. Every platform in this category was built with this mechanic not as an incidental byproduct of the user experience, but as its deliberate core. Your dopamine is not a side effect of their business model. Your dopamine is their business model. Consider a person we'll call Michael, a 32-year-old software developer in San Francisco. By every external measure, a capable and intelligent person. Someone who used to read a book each week without any particular effort, who could sit with a difficult technical problem for hours without needing to interrupt himself. A few years ago, he began noticing changes he couldn't explain. He would open a book and within 2 pages find his hand moving toward his phone, not as a decision, but as a reflex, the way your hand moves toward your face when something is flying toward it. He would sit down to work on a complex problem and discover that after 15 minutes, his concentration had dissolved. He would go for a walk and feel a specific, almost physical discomfort in the absence of audio input, as though silence had become something his nervous system no longer knew how to tolerate. He consulted a neurologist. He underwent testing. Everything came back within normal ranges. The brain itself was structurally fine. What had changed was not the brain's structure, but its calibration. Dr. Anna Lembke, professor of psychiatry at Stanford University School of Medicine, chief of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Dual Diagnosis Clinic, and author of the New York Times best-selling book Dopamine Nation, describes this process in precise terms. When the brain is repeatedly exposed to high dopamine stimulation, it responds by reducing the sensitivity of its own dopamine receptors, a process called downregulation. The brain is attempting to restore homeostasis, to compensate for the unnaturally high levels of stimulation it is receiving by lowering its baseline sensitivity to dopamine signals generally. Lembke calls the resulting condition a chronic dopamine deficit state, a persistent condition in which the brain's reward pathways have been recalibrated downward, making ordinary pleasures, a conversation, a walk, a paragraph of a book, feel insufficient to register as rewarding. The analogy that captures this most accurately is the experience of moving next to an airport. In the first weeks, the aircraft are genuinely unbearable, intrusive, disruptive, impossible to ignore. Within a month or two, most people stop consciously hearing them. The auditory system has adapted by reducing its sensitivity to that specific stimulus. The planes haven't changed. The threshold has. The same process applies here, with one crucial difference. It is not just the specific stimulus, the social media notification, the short video, that stops registering. The recalibration is general. Ordinary life, with its quieter and slower pleasures, falls below the threshold that the brain now requires to generate a meaningful response. What TikTok's algorithm does with extraordinary effectiveness is continuously calibrate its content to stay above whatever your current threshold happens to be, finding the next dose strong enough to break through, which is why the platform continues to work even as everything else feels flat. Michael went 30 days completely off social media. The first week was genuinely difficult, boring in a way that felt almost physical, restless, and uncomfortable. By the second week, something had begun to shift. By the end of the third week, he finished a book in 2 days. The receptors had recovered their sensitivity. The quiet signals of ordinary life were audible again. If any of what Michael experienced sounds familiar, and for a very large number of people, it will, the appropriate response is not self-reproach. This is the predictable outcome of a nervous system doing exactly what nervous systems do when exposed to stimulation that it did not evolve to handle. It is physiology, and it is reversible. The argument so far might suggest that dopamine is the problem, that the wanting system is itself the source of the difficulty. That would be a misreading of the science, and an important one to correct. Dopamine is not the enemy. It is, as Lembke writes, the most important motivational architecture the human brain possesses. The problem has never been the molecule. The problem is the mismatch between the environments it evolved to navigate and the ones we have built around it. Because dopamine fires for all kinds of pursuits, when you are working on a genuinely difficult problem, and you can feel the solution approaching. That sustained, almost physical sense of something coming together, that is dopamine. When you are training consistently and can feel your physical capacity increasing week by week, dopamine. When you are learning something genuinely hard and the concept finally resolves into clarity, dopamine. When you are building a relationship over time and feel the depth of it growing, dopamine. What distinguishes these experiences from the scroll is not the neurochemistry, but the timeline. Sapolsky has pointed out something remarkable about humans compared to every other primate. A monkey can sustain dopamine anticipation for a few seconds, just long enough to press the lever and wait for the reward. A human being can sustain it for months, years, even decades, working toward a goal that may be far in the future, across a career, across a marriage, across a lifetime. This capacity to hold a goal in mind across vast stretches of time and keep the wanting system engaged with it is what Sapolsky argues underlies every major long-term human achievement. What Lembke observes in her clinical work is what happens when that capacity is eroded. A brain that has been trained on rapid reward cycles loses the ability to tolerate the discomfort of genuine uncertainty, the kind that stretches not across seconds, but across weeks and months. It loses the patience to remain with a hard problem. It loses, in her phrase, the ability to just be bored for a minute. That loss matters more than it might appear, because boredom, genuine, unstructured boredom with no incoming stimulation, is not an absence of cognitive activity. It is the condition under which one of the most productive systems in the brain activates. Gloria Mark's research at UC Irvine on the default mode network, the neural circuitry that engages when external demands fall away, suggests that this is when the brain does some of its most important generative work, consolidating memories, making unexpected connections between seemingly unrelated ideas, working through problems that were not consciously posed. The best ideas arrive in the shower, on long drives, in the half-conscious state just before sleep, not because those are mystical conditions, but because they are the conditions under which the noise finally stops and the default mode network can actually do its job. You've probably heard the term dopamine detox. It sounds right. It's become a popular idea, but it describes something that is neurologically impossible. Dopamine is synthesized by your brain on an ongoing basis. You cannot deplete it through abstinence or purge it through behavior change. The concept, as Lembke explains it, gets the mechanism backwards. What is possible, and what the evidence supports, is receptor recovery. When the overstimulation stops, the downregulated receptors gradually restore their sensitivity. The brain's calibration shifts back toward its baseline. This takes time, and it requires a different relationship with the sources of high dopamine stimulation that drove the downregulation in the first place. The research points towards several specific interventions. The first involves protecting the morning. Gloria Mark's work suggests that a brain that does not begin the day in reactive consumption mode, checking notifications, scrolling feeds, responding to incoming demands before its own internal state has stabilized, maintains its capacity for sustained concentration significantly longer throughout the day. Even 30 minutes of screen-free time after waking, maintained consistently over 3 weeks, produces measurable improvements in anxiety levels and attentional performance. The second involves the structure of work itself. Every completed task generates a genuine dopamine signal, a real neurochemical event, not a metaphor. The practical implication of this is that the granularity of task definition matters enormously. The instruction to write a report generates no dopamine signal until the report is finished. The instruction to write one paragraph generates a signal the moment that paragraph is complete. Smaller units of completion, stacked consistently, create a pattern of genuine neurochemical reinforcement that builds rather than depletes. The third is physical exercise, which is the only intervention in the literature shown to produce a sustained elevation of baseline dopamine sensitivity. Not a temporary spike, but a genuine upward shift in the floor. After several consistent weeks of training, ordinary life begins to feel more rewarding not because anything external has changed, but because the receptors have recovered their capacity to respond to the quieter signals that were previously falling below threshold. Michael, 3 months after his 30-day abstinence, described it this way. Tuesday evening started feeling like something again. Not exciting, just present. That is what receptor recovery actually looks like. The fourth is the 5 5-second pause. Not a prohibition, simply a pause of 5 seconds before opening a social media application, during which you ask yourself whether you are opening it because you want to or because your thumb moved there automatically. That gap between stimulus and action is neurologically sufficient to interrupt the automatic loop and restore the element of conscious choice. The fifth involves substituting digital uncertainty with real uncertainty, recognizing that the dopamine system responds to the not knowing of a hard creative project or a new skill with the same neurochemical intensity as the not knowing of a like count, and that the effects on your life of these two forms of uncertainty could not be more different. In 1954, Olds and Milner believed they had located the source of human happiness inside the brain of a rat. What they had actually found was something more interesting and more consequential: the engine. This molecule is what drove your ancestors across continents in search of resources that might not be there. It is what sustains the researcher through years of work on a problem that may not yield. It is what Robert Sapolsky identifies as the mechanism that makes human beings uniquely capable of working toward goals that are years or decades away, of maintaining the wanting across timescales that no other species can access. Every sustained human achievement that required effort directed toward an uncertain future has dopamine somewhere at its foundation. But somewhere in the history of the past 20 years, the people who understood this system most thoroughly figured out how to redirect it, how to turn the engine into a loop that feeds itself, points at a 6-inch screen, and generates revenue by the second from the engagement it produces. The problem was never the molecule. The problem was that no one sat down and explained to you how it actually works. Now you know. Dopamine is not the chemistry of happiness. It is the chemistry of pursuit. It does not reward you for arriving. It drives you to keep moving toward the next thing. And you have more control over what that next thing is than the design of your phone would like you to believe. One path is chosen for you by an algorithm built to keep you in the loop. The other one is yours to direct. One experiment. Try it. Tomorrow morning, for the first 30 minutes after you wake up, leave the screen off. No phone, no notifications, no incoming information of any kind. Just you and whatever your mind produces in the quiet before the noise begins. Then come back and tell me in the comments what happened. Not what you expected to feel, what you actually felt. Because for a lot of people, the first thing that shows up in the quiet is something they've been too busy to notice for a long time. I read every single one.